Okay.
Recording's in progress.
We'll get started. Thanks to all of you for attending tonight. We have the pleasure of having Jonathan Perman, in addition to being Rabbi Julie's brother-in-law. He is the founder and now co-director of the American Congressional Exchange. I think all of us who listen to the news and read the newspapers are acutely aware that we have folks who are on opposite ends of the spectrum and in their political thought. And I think what Jonathan's going to share with us tonight is an opportunity for us to learn about how we can foster good relationships with people who may be on a different point of view. I'm going to encourage all of you to potentially read the book by Monica Guzman, I Never Thought of It That Way, which deals with the same kind of thought process, meaning getting along with people with opposing views. Jonathan actually began his career in the 1980s, and he worked for a congressional coalition from the Northeast and the Midwest. He continued on to be a professional staff member for the U.S. Senate Government Affairs Subcommittee on Energy, Nuclear Proliferation, and Government. And my favorite part of his bio was that he was a member of the Capitol Steps, which happens to be a group that we've seen many times and really adore. So yay, Jonathan.
All right, that's the it all went downhill from there. That was the high.
No.
Tanglewood and the Berkshires.
Jonathan served as the Director of Government Affairs for the Greater New Haven, Connecticut Chamber of Commerce, and then a similar position in Evanston, Illinois. So he has experience across the country. And in 2006, he founded the Perman Group, a public affairs and public policy consultancy based in Chicago. And that's where the American Congressional Exchange had its beginning. In addition to his work here, he is an accomplished corporate and government public affairs executive and civic leader. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan. I'm going to ask that everybody mute themselves. After Jonathan shares his presentation with us, there'll be opportunities, and given that we are a small group, I'm not going to ask you to put your questions in the chat, which was my original thought process, but we'll have ample time for everyone to ask him questions. So Jonathan, I turn it over to you, and Leslie, you put it in speaker.
Great. I'm going to try, what I'm going to do is try to intersperse my comments with a few videos. So if I can share screen, which I will do, I'm not sure if you have to give me permission to do that. You may.
You have permission.
Thank you.
I put it already, yeah.
All right. And I want to make sure that you can both see and hear this, but let's give it a try here. Does that work? Are you hearing that?
We're good. We hear, we see it.
Okay.
We're not hearing it. I think you need to make sure when you're sharing it to share the sound. So you might need to stop it and reshare it after you share the sound.
Yeah. Hold on a second. Sorry. I always forget this piece. Hold on. Share. There it is. I got it. Thanks, Julie. Okay, here we go. Okay? Okay.
The American Congressional Exchange is a program that we have that BPC started where we bring two members together, a Republican and a Democrat from two very different parts of the country, and we have them visit each individual's districts and really get to know not only that member, but also that district.
Now, up until that trip, I did not know David Trone. And because of his willingness to make the trip, to come out to spend that time with me. I can testify that I now have a friend and an ally on many issues of mutual concern.
Many of us share the same principles, and we bring to the table different life experiences, different political perspectives. We shouldn't find that dangerous or divisive. We should find it something to celebrate.
This is how America works, is by coming together, rolling up our sleeves, getting away from the partisanship, getting away from the rhetoric, and getting back to just delivering.
When you have a conversation with people and you laugh and you get to know them, you no longer see them in the same light, and you're much more willing to say, let's figure out how we can be friends and really find solutions. It creates a different type of dialogue and friendship that exists, and it also allows those members to see how different parts of the country are and how many similarities there are.
So that was a celebration of our 5th anniversary of the ACE program, ACE, the American Congressional Exchange, which is sponsored by the Bipartisan Policy Center, a think tank in Washington. But what I'd like to do is take you back 12 years ago, where this idea was born. And it comes from a milestone birthday that I celebrated where I brought together 10 friends from different parts of my life, from high school, from college, graduate school, professional life, not all of whom knew each other. And we spent a week in the high Sierras, in the Yosemite National Park on the back eastern side of the Sierras, on a very adventurous and challenging hiking trip. And what I saw over that week period of time was this amazing, probably not surprisingly, but to witness it myself, this amazing bonding that took place amongst these 10 guys that, again, didn't all know each other and became very fast friends. And after that, we repeated over several years more trips like that. So fast forward several years later, and it's 2016, and this has nothing to do with Trump's ascendancy. I was only focused on the Congress because that's where I cut my teeth on politics early in my career. And like many people, I had become very disappointed with what had happened to our national legislative branch of government. And I decided that I wanted to do something about it. And so I thought back to that trip, and it struck me that if I could combine my two passions, which are politics and travel, that maybe there's an equation that could be built here that could result in bringing people together, in this case, members of Congress, to try to build relationships. And that's how the American Congressional Exchange was born. It was a great idea, but at the end of the day, who really cares what Jonathan Perman thinks? The question is, who else thinks this is a good idea? And so I spent the next 6 months going back and forth to Washington, D.C., and meeting with journalists and thought leaders and former members of Congress and current members of Congress and staff members, think tanks. And
put it on my phone too.
No, you won't. It'll be terrible sound.
You will get one, believe me.
Sarah, please mute yourself.
Are we muted?
Sarah, please mute yourself.
Okay. And everyone that I spoke with, to the one, said, this is a great idea. Like, you should really go forth and make this happen. So then I went back to Chicago and talked with my wife, Melissa, and I said, well, now what? Now what do I do? And she said, well, you really have two choices. You can start a board of directors and raise some money and try to build your own organization. That's probably going to take a long time. Better to put your ego aside and take this idea to an existing organization that may have resources and would embrace the idea. And so that's indeed what I did. And I went to an organization called the Bipartisan Policy Center, which was founded about 15 years ago by 4 former US Senate majority leaders, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. And the idea was to create a venue and a think tank where former members and current members of Congress could get together with their staffs and with policy experts and try to hammer out solutions to some of our nation's more intractable problems. BPC now has grown to become a $30 million think tank with 100 professional staff. They work in areas ranging from agriculture to immigration to health to workforce and development, and governance, meaning how can we make our governmental institutions function more effectively. And so the bipartisan policy, or really the American Congressional Exchange, falls under that piece of the portfolio, the governance piece. And indeed, they embraced it. And by 2017, they had become an independent contractor to the Bipartisan Policy Center to manage ACE. And we spent several months putting the pieces together, a structure behind it, raising some money. And in 2018, early 2018, we launched our first trip. And our two guinea pigs for the first trip were a conservative Republican from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, who came down, whose name is Jack Bergman, former three-star retired Marine general, who came down to visit Stephanie Murphy, a moderate Democrat from the Orlando area who just retired a few months ago from the Congress. And we were sitting at dinner the first night, and I was, lucky enough to be staffing that event. And just organically, and by the way, I should say, the two of them had only met once at a White House Christmas party. Other than that, they didn't really know each other at all. And just organically, out came their common but different stories about Vietnam. So Jack Bergman had flown medic helicopters in the Vietnam War. Stephanie Murphy's family escaped from Vietnam as part of the boat people when Saigon fell in 1970, only to be picked up at sea by a U.S. Navy ship to save their lives. She was about 6 months old, so she doesn't literally remember it, but nonetheless. And so here we were, fast forward 40 years later, and these two members of Congress are sitting down to dinner with their common but different Vietnam experiences that they didn't even know about with one another. And they finished telling their stories, and I said, stop. I said, this is unbelievable. I said, only in America could you have a moment where two people with, these different Vietnam experiences are now, and of different generations. He's old enough to be her father. And they're having dinner together and talking about bipartisanship. So we went on to do about a day and a half of further stops and activities in the Orlando area revolving around military and veterans and high technology, particularly for the entertainment industry in the Orlando area. And then 5 weeks later, the two members introduced legislation together that ended up becoming an amendment to another larger piece of legislation. But they both said on the House floor in public statements that but for the trip, they never would have gotten together and done such a thing. And so we were pinching ourselves. This was our very first trip, and we had an outcome like that. So we went on to do 6 more trips in that year, 2018. We did 13 trips the next year. In 2020, a little thing called COVID-19 came along, which brought a temporary halt to some of our trips or lessened the number of trips. But now we're back on the road full time, and we have done about 40 of these trips since the founding in 2018. And two big takeaways. One is that when we started the program, we thought that it would be mainly moderates that would be participating on both sides of the aisle. Turns out about 80% of the participants are from outside the political middle. So we've had everyone from a very, member of the Freedom Caucus all the way over to a progressive Democrat that have participated. And that's actually a better outcome. We were looking for more participation across the political spectrum. And the second part, which is probably the most rewarding, is that when members finish these trips, they actually start working together. And they find areas where they can collaborate and introduce legislation and co-sponsor one another's bills, and their staffs, which is just as important, start working together. And, we're not Pollyannish about this. We know that this program by itself is not going to solve the long-term financing of the Social Security system. But there's a lot of other things that have happened in legislation and good works that have occurred because of the relationships that are built through that program. So that's the quick synopsis, but let me take a step back and talk about some of the things that inspired me and that are now ingrained in the program as it takes on its sixth year of action. It starts with actually your former senator and former vice president, now president, Joe Biden. In 2017, the Bipartisan Policy Center gives out every few years a sort of a lifetime achievement award called the Patriot Award for someone who really exemplifies bipartisanship through their works, through their career, and through their words. And so Joe Biden was given that award in 2017. This is before he had announced for a run for the presidency. And at that award celebration, there were a few things that he said that I thought were really poignant. He said the coin of the realm is that you can be trusted to say what you are going to do. It's all about trust. That's the currency of politics and of Congress in particular. He also said that it's hard to dislike someone on the other side when you understand their personal problems and their struggles, when you really get to know that person in a deep and personal way. And then he said, if you look hard enough, you can even find the possibility of some agreement and change, even in people that have very extreme views. It may be hard, but you can find it. And then he went on to tell a story that from his memoir. Many of you have probably heard this before, but it's worth saying again. When he was a young senator traveling on Amtrak between Washington and Wilmington, he said that the single most important piece of advice that he got in his career came from the late Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, a titan of the Senate from Montana. And he told Biden, your job here is to find the good things in your colleagues, the things that their state saw, the voters saw and elected them, and not focus on the bad. And then Mansfield also said to Biden, it's always relevant to question someone's judgment, but it's not relevant to question their motive. Because once you start questioning a motive, it's pretty hard to get to a place where you can reach agreement. You can differ with a person, with a colleague on their judgment, but don't stay away from the motive. And I think Biden took that to heart throughout his career. I want to go back to a time when things were a lot different on Capitol Hill. And one of the stories I like to repeat is when Lyndon Johnson became president after President Kennedy's death. Many don't remember, but for a year and a half, we didn't actually have a vice president because Johnson had assumed the office and there was no one appointed as vice president. And so without a vice president, without a president of the Senate, Lyndon Johnson had to find another proxy for getting his bills through. And he chose Hubert Humphrey, who was his protege and who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time. But Johnson knew that he had to work with Republicans on the other side of the aisle because while they had the majority, they didn't have complete majority by any means. And so he went to Humphrey and he said, you've got to go work with, this is Johnson saying, you got to go work with the Republican leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois, who everybody called Ev. And Johnson said, you and I are going to get Ev. It's going to take time. We're going to get him. You make up your mind now that you've got to spend time with Ev Dirksen. You've got to let him have a piece of the action. He's got to look good all the time. Don't let those liberal bomb throwers talk you out of seeing Dirksen. You got to get in there to see Dirksen. You drink with Dirksen. You talk with Dirksen. You listen to Dirksen. That's the way things were done back then, where people got in a room and they really built relationships and they got to know the folks on the other side of the aisle because they needed to. They socialized with them, they drank with them, and they formed bonds and friendships. And that's the next point I want to get to is friendship, because as I began to devise this idea, it struck me that friendship, again, coming from that trip that we did out west with my friends, was what it was all about. And David Brooks in 2014 wrote a really clever piece called The Social and Political Benefits of Having Friends. And he said there were three areas, there were three major benefits that came from friendship. One is friendship helps people make better judgments. So much of a deep friendship is thinking through problems together, what job to take, who to marry. Friendship allows you to see your own life, but with a second sympathetic self. Second thing Brooks said was that friends usually bring out better versions of each other. People feel unguarded and fluid with their close friends. If you're hanging around with a friend, smarter and funnier thoughts tend to come burbling out. And finally, he said, people behave better if they know that their friends are observing them. Friendship is based in part on common tastes and interests, but it's also based on mutual admiration and reciprocity. And people tend to live up to their friends' high regard. And so a lot of what what ACE is about is making friends, is building those kinds of relationships that are not just temporary, but hopefully very long lasting. I'm going to take a time out from my talk and give you a taste of what one of the trips is like. So this is a trip that we did the first year in 2018. We had a conservative Republican from Arkansas named Steve Womack, a member of the Appropriations Committee, go to Washington State to visit Derek Kilmer, a moderate Democrat. Kilmer's district is an enormous district where you've got to hop between islands throughout Puget Sound to get to places. And about 25% of his district geographically is Olympic National Park. So of course, we started our trip in Olympic National Park. So without further ado, let me give you a taste of what that trip was like. Is it working?
Not seeing it.
Oh, wait, I got the wrong. Sorry.
Sharing, yeah. Share, make sure you're sharing the sound too. Yeah.
That it?
Good, it's good.
If you go back over time on all of the major issues that faced this country, every single solution was bipartisan. All members are driven largely by their personal experiences. I was mayor for 12 years in a city in northwest Arkansas that was not living within its means, and we were missing out on a lot of opportunities. And so I became a mayor and changed a lot of that. So since arriving in Congress, and I try to use my experience as a mayor in trying to help this country develop a model to make sure that we have good paying jobs and opportunities for young people and kind of reinvent ourselves as an economy that makes things, produces things, and we can grow ourselves out of the predicament we're in.
My priorities are very much in line with the district I represent. I grew up in my districts, and I was in high school around the time the timber industry took it on the chin, and I saw a bunch of my friends' parents lose their jobs. So a lot of my focus is to try to move that needle in terms of economic opportunity in my district. As often been said, there's not Republican roads and Democratic bridges. That's an opportunity in a district like Steve's, where trucking is a big industry, and he's got America's largest retailer. Infrastructure matters. In a district like mine, where we've got not just the Port of Tacoma, but a stone's throw from Amazon and Microsoft, we're in the bottom 20% in the country when it comes to access to high-speed internet. I would argue that that should be part of the infrastructure conversation as well.
So just a quick tidbit about that trip. Steve Womack represents Northwest Arkansas. So Bentonville, where Walmart is headquartered, also the J.B. Hunt Trucking Company, if you've ever seen their yellow signature trucks. And he also represents in Arkansas a interior state. It's not a coastline, so there's no ports in Arkansas. He had never been to a major port before. So we took him to the Port of Tacoma, which is the 4th largest port in the country. Took him up in one of those cranes overlooking the port, maybe about 80 feet up. And there, right before his eyes, he saw the entire supply chain. He saw ships docking at the port filled with product being loaded onto trains and trucks, some of those trucks being the J.B. Hunt Company, and some of that product that'll end up being put on the shelves of Walmart, which is also headquartered in his district. He comes down from the crane, and I got to tell you, he's like a kid in a candy store. He cannot believe what he just saw. He gets on the phone to Mrs. Hunt, who's like the heiress to the Hunt fortune. You won't believe where I just came from. He said, when I take Kilmer down to Arkansas, we got to stop by your shop and talk about logistics and transportation. He was just blown away. So those are the kinds of moments that we really try to strive for on these trips, where they will experience things and meet people and do activities and tour places that they never could have imagined and that they never would have gotten the opportunity to do otherwise. And that really changes their viewpoint and gets them to better understand, oh, well, now I get it. Now I know why Derek Kilmer votes the way he does. Now I understand why he speechifies the way he does. You know, suddenly, you know, I'm interested in trucking, and suddenly I'm interested in ports, and suddenly I'm interested in the resources that national parks may have or have not, which I didn't have before, just by having the opportunity to experience that. So why is it that Congress is so torn? Why is our legislative system somewhat broken, or very broken, depending on how your viewpoint? I'm going to give you a few reasons. Part of it, believe it or not, starts with aviation. And you may say to yourself, aviation? The hell does that have to do with it? Well, think back before about the mid-1960s or so, because we take it for granted now. But the idea of a member of Congress being able to fly home to their district for the weekend was unheard of. The aviation system was not banded together that way. Yes, if you lived in Delaware, you could get back, rather, if you live in Washington, D.C., you could get home to Delaware on a train. You could get up to New York, you could go to Chicago. But if you represent Salt Lake City or Albuquerque or Seattle, before the 1960s, the idea of going home to your district for the weekend, you couldn't do it. So you moved to Washington with your families and you lived in Washington. And there in Washington, there was a whole social culture that developed. People had each other over for barbecues. Their kids went to school together. They coached each other's softball teams. Their kids' softball teams. There was a lot more drinking that went on. It was also a Congress that had a much different social and cultural makeup. It was basically a legislative body of white men, white older men. Today, Congress is a much more diverse body. I don't think we'd want to go back to the way it was, but it was a lot easier back then when you've got more homogeneity in the culture to be able to develop relationships. Today, members of Congress fly in on, Monday night, Tuesday morning. They're there for typically in a week, 2 or 3 nights, and then they get the first plane out of Washington as soon as the congressional session ends that week to go back home, because they don't want to be seen as being too DC. It's not thought of as a positive thing, that you need to go back to your district, to your people. So the amount of time that a member of Congress has to spend in Washington building relationships is really limited. During their week, they're pretty much sequestered in their own caucus, their own committee. You get to know the members of your committee or subcommittee, but getting to know other people. I mean, first of all, it'd be pretty hard to get to know 434 other people well, just from the math, okay? But the pandemic has made it worse. It's not easy to build relationships. In fact, the average legislator's life probably has more in common with a traveling salesman or woman or a telemarketer than a statesman or woman, or even a CEO. Their physical setup, for those of you who have been to Capitol Hill, and if you haven't, it's crazy. They have these little offices where they're working on top of each other with staff, most of whom are pretty junior in terms of their knowledge. And you've got 435 different offices. I mean, compare that to like the business world, which is very often focused on collaboration and setting up physical spaces where people can pass each other in the hallways. At least this is before remote working. But the whole culture of Capitol Hill is very much individualism and divide, meaning you're divided among these 435 various offices. So again, hard to work together. The other another problem is that since Watergate and the thrust in our country to be more transparent and having C-SPAN and having, hearings and everything being on television and sound bites, it's hard to find moments of privacy because the spotlight is always shining on you. And while that may be good in some ways for democracy, it's not easy to make deals and to work in a private way, which is sometimes necessary in order to reach agreement. Another thing that changed about 15 years ago was the abolition, although it's starting to come back now, of what are called earmarks, which were often called the currency of compromise. So, you support my bill, and then I'll support the $1 million grant for your social and human service program in your district. That was taken down, that whole idea, because, well, you could argue there was a lot of wasteful spending that came from it. On the other hand, it was a powerful form of currency and way to make compromise. Another challenge is that there's way too many committees. And so members of Congress can't spend, because they're being torn to go from this committee to this subcommittee. They can't really get to know members because they're moving around constantly over the course of the day, and the leadership becomes very diffuse. They also spend a lot of time on fundraising. You all know that. Another change in the culture is that there's a lot fewer military leaders or people with military experience. And why is that important? Because in general, people that have served in the military, veterans, have the experience of putting country before party. And with a lot fewer people with military experience now and that provided a base and a culture of compromise. Those people tended to be more willing to see the other side. And when you don't have as many examples of that, it makes it more difficult. The last thing is staffing. The salaries and compensation for congressional staff are really, really low. And what happens is they spend a couple of years in a congressional office, get that experience, and then they're lured to downtown or K Street to go work for a lobbying shop. And so you've got congressional staff that are really junior and don't have the historical knowledge to be able to bring reports and bring ideas to members of Congress that they would be able to if they had that kind of background. So, in today's political culture, personal relationships, private handshakes, principled compromise is in fact discouraged. And while the culture of collaboration, which once steeled our American democracy to withstand narrow interests and occasional pernicious actors, has really been worn away. And so, when familiarity can, in some cases, breed contempt in a democracy, it's really the lifeblood of progress. You've got to have that kind of familiarity. And so the importance of personal interaction outside the negotiating room, in those moments where you can really get to know one another, bring people forward that often have conflicting interests to forge collaborative solutions. And the equation for resolution of these very difficult choices almost never rests with a policy twist or a newly uncovered fact, but it's really the bonds that have been formed among those who are in negotiation to find resolution. And inevitably, the obstacle to success is cleared by a few people from opposing camps who really like each other. That's the real value there. And that's what really works, is when people can sit down and really understand and like one another. Here's another example of two people that came from very different backgrounds. We had Ed Case, who is a moderate Democrat from Hawaii, and he came to visit Chris Stewart, who is a conservative in Utah. So give me a moment and I will tee up this trip for you.
Do this. Go for it.
couple of first day observations. Incredible state. Just so much going on. So much that I think a little flying under the radar from the national scope. So that's been a real surprise in many areas. The vitality of the growth of industries that are on the cutting edge here, to include recursion right here, is really what many parts of our country aspire to do, marrying up really a tremendous educational system that feeds into, you know, world-class university, feeds into world-class R&D, and into world-leading companies. I'm excited to get out and as we say in Hawaii, talk story or converse and share thoughts with a part of the country that philosophically, from a party perspective, is very, very different from my constituency. So to engage on, you know, many of the issues that we're facing in Washington, but from a far different perspective than I hear among my own constituents, that's what I'm really looking forward to.
Congressman Stewart, care to respond to the rumors that Congressman Case has been beating you up the trail?
Well, it's clearly not true, and I don't think anyone would take it seriously, so I'm not going to respond.
I'd like to do an age handicap check on that.
Well,
not that I need age, you know, to prove myself.
You are anyway.
Huh?
I'm older than you are.
No, I'm not.
How old are you?
68.
You are really? Oh wow, if I'd known that, I would have walked slower. It's always magic, every single time. You cannot get tired of this. You can't grow accustomed to it. It's just too spectacular.
The exchange here is about trying to fix Washington, and you have to fix it kind of, you know, one step at a time. You can't just like wake up one day and Washington's going to be better. You've got to chip away at it, and one way is relationship-wise, because when you get to know somebody and get to know their districts and why they do what they do and say what they say, then I think that at least gives you a basis for trying to find some common ground, as opposed to just dismissing people outright. My party's in the majority right now in Congress, and so if you have any questions about what the heck is going on, I'll answer you honestly. Okay.
Okay. One of the that moment you saw there when they were at Bryce Canyon looking over the Great Canyon there, I was standing behind them, and it suddenly struck me, you know, it doesn't really matter if one of them thinks that God made that canyon and another one thinks that 75 million years of evolution made it. What matters is that they both shared that experience together, and they will never forget that. And it just struck me of these two people coming from much different backgrounds, and having and they did a reciprocal trip the next year together, and they still talked about that hike where we got them up at 6 in the morning to climb 1,500 vertical feet over the course of a couple miles. So those kinds of, again, moments are really important and a big part of what makes this program, we think, so successful. I'm just going to give you a couple more anecdotes, and then I'm going to stop and open it up for Q&A. One of the things that you learn on these trips is just is the different language that is used around the country to describe things. So we had two members of Congress, a progressive Democrat named Alan Lowenthal, who came from Long Beach, California. And so he represents the Pacific Coast, right? And he visited Garrett Graves, who, a Republican, represents the Cajun Bayou, not Cajun, but the Bayou area of Louisiana, in a district where on that coastline, every 90 minutes, the equivalent of a football field of land is lost to the sea. Literally. That's how quickly it's stinking. But in Louisiana, you can't use the term climate change, but you can use the term sea level rise. When you go to Long Beach, yeah, you can use the word climate change, but it's a different way to describe something, and you got to understand that distinction and how to use language. Both of these guys represent big bodies of water, the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana, the Pacific Ocean. They both represent areas that are doing oil and gas exploration and pumping. There are still plenty of oil rigs off the coast of Long Beach. They have sport fishing off of both their coasts. They have beautiful recreational areas and areas that they want to conserve. So they have a lot in common. They just happen to represent different bodies of water, and they found plenty of areas where they could reach common ground. So that was a real eye-opener. Anyways, I've been talking for a long time, so why don't I stop? You can take off your mutes, and let's open it up for questions.
In order to keep things going, Jonathan, do you want to do the calling on because people have their name, or do you want me to do it? And
why don't you do it? You know your congregation better than I do.
Okay.
And I was just going to say, if people are comfortable putting their camera, I know not everybody might be, but it would be nice because this is being recorded and I know a lot of people want to see it later. So it'd be nice to see who was here. Thank you.
Wait.
We actually,
if possible, I know that sometimes there's a reason you need to.
We actually had our first question came on through the chat, and it was from Ellen Rabinowitz. Ellen, do you want to read your question, ask your questions, or would you like me to?
I see the question. I can answer it.
Okay.
You can.
You can ask. Okay, go ahead.
How many are actively involved yearly? So we're trying to do 10 to 12 trips a year. Obviously we did less during the peak of COVID, but that's what our aim is right now. We have not done senators yet, but we are looking at doing that. It's a little more difficult because you have to cover an entire state. And I should also say we have no shortage of interest. We have, in fact, more members that want to do these trips than we even have capacity. The second question was how are we funded? So the Bipartisan Policy Center is a 501c3 nonprofit that's funded through a combination of foundation grants, corporate giving, and individual givers. And the giving is really bipartisan in its shape.
Okay, Al.
Yeah, my question, Mr. Is it Perlman or Perman?
No L, Perman.
Okay, Mr. Perman, thank you. I guess one of my basic questions is, as far as getting a Dem and a Republican together to do these programs, which is really great. I'm just wondering overall, what does the 24-hour news cycle, has that changed a bit about the tone of Congress these days?
Yeah, there's no question about that. I mean, you're always on guard. You always have to be up for a quote or a comment. So there's a lot of pressure for members to be in the public realm as far as the media is concerned. And unfortunately, what it also lends itself to is the advent of people who are entertainers and who are just there to be on TV as opposed to legislating. In fact, we had one member, Dean Phillips, who's a Jewish member from Minnesota, and he coined the term angertainer, which I thought was really appropriate. So there's a bunch of angertainers who are there not to legislate. They are there to be on the 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock news, and that's how they judge their success. We are not interested in having those folks on our trip, and quite frankly, I don't think they'd be interested in participating anyways. So,
thank you,
Barbara, and then Alan.
Yeah. My sister is Phyllis Bloom, so I'm not a member, but Phyllis is of Seaside. In any event, I think it's a good thing to have these trips. Suspicion is that the issues that are addressed are the less controversial ones, the less polarizing ones, and the people who participate, are not the extremists. I imagine you wouldn't have a Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you probably wouldn't have Ilhan Omar either. And so, and I guess this is more of a comment than than a question, but it just strikes me that I guess I take a very skeptical view of most of the politicians, and it just strikes me that most of them, really just care about their own election, and they don't really seem to care a lot about the country, and they care more about how their policies are going to affect donations and the polls. I guess finally the question would be, I assume that you wouldn't get into issues like abortion or, gender identity issues or gun policy.
Partly true, but not entirely. We did a trip to Uvalde a couple months after the shooting. We didn't plan it that way, but we had a trip set up in the member of Congress's district where Uvalde is. And so indeed we had, not only a very moving visit and moment with visiting the memorials and the area and seeing, at least from a distance, the school, but meeting with officials there. And yes, we did have some conversations about gun control. Did we resolve anything in that, our discussion? No. But we don't, we don't shy away from controversial issues. That being said, controversial issues are not going to be the basis for forming relationships. What's going to form relationships that can lead to resolution of controversial issues is winning, involving members in areas where they can get wins, where they can chalk up a record of legislation that may not be so profound or as interesting to someone who is passionate about abortion or gun control or some of the hot button issues, but nonetheless is important for their district and for the country. There's more at stake than just the top, 5 big lightning rod issues.
Basically finding common ground, because maybe half of the issues that they could deal with sort of globally could be common ground issues. That's the point of what you're doing.
Yeah, it's also just common nature. When you meet somebody for the first time, your first discussions are not going to be about controversial subjects for the most part. You're going to start in developing your relationship by doing the easy stuff and by finding areas where you do agree or things that you could enjoy together. And then as you gain trust, which is the most important piece of this, and you become more comfortable discussing things that are a bit more controversial, but you don't start from that. I don't think you can start any relationship. Even throw out politics. I don't think you can start any relationship that way.
Alan.
Yeah. So first of all, Jonathan, thank you very much for this, and congratulations to you. This is an amazing program, and I'm so happy to hear that you say there's no lack of interest, because that's heartening given the environment that we live in these days. I have a number of questions. Let me just take it from the top. How do you match people up? How does that come about?
How do we make a shidduch?
Yeah.
Yes, as they say, back where I come from.
All right. Well, no, it's a very good question. So we have reached out to most of the 435 members. We have in the first few years, we really deferred to them. We would say, who is it on the other side of the aisle that you would like to get to know better or to know at all? It could be for a political purpose. It could be for a strategic legislative purpose, but who do you want to form a relationship with? We got feedback, and oftentimes it would take a long time for them to sort of think about it and go through the list. Now we're being much more intentional in how we make the pairings. We're going to members and actually suggesting to them 2 or 3 members who, for example, may have, when we do a lot of research about the members, we're looking for members who have different kinds of districts so that they will learn and go to a place that is vastly different in culture and economy and social makeup than the district that they're accustomed to. We also look for common issue interests. So you might take 2 members of the Energy and Commerce Committee who are focused on telecommunications. And maybe they are on the same committee, but on different subcommittees. So you get to know your subcommittee colleagues, but you don't necessarily get to know the other subcommittees. So that is often a way that we bring about the pairing. And so then what we'll do is when we've identified a member and suggested to them, and they comes back with a positive answer, then we'll go to that member and say, well, so Leslie wants to pair with Alan, and they'll say, usually they say yes. And once the agreement is made, then the next step is to decide who's going to be the host member and who is going to be the traveling member. We don't care, whoever. And the idea behind it is that after member A visits member B, if the first date works, then member B will visit in a reciprocal trip with member A.
Okay.
That's the expectation. And I'm proud to tell you that, except in a few cases where a member didn't get reelected, but that wasn't our fault, we've always had a reciprocal trip.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
Of my 20 questions here, are the trips roughly choreographed? I mean, do you say to
very
the?
much so. Yeah.
Okay.
So you've got anywhere from most of the trips are 24 to 48 hours, and the length of the trip is based on the geographic size of the district. So urban, tightly compact districts tend to be like 24 hours. There are other districts, especially as you get out west, where we actually, in one case, took a flight within the district because it was so large. That district in Utah was the one where we took a flight. So those tend to be longer durations. And the itinerary is absolutely jam-packed. So they may be doing 6, 7, 8 stops in a day. It's usually like a 12 or 14-hour day, and members come back from these trips and they're thoroughly exhausted, but in the most positive sense. So, although I will also tell you something else, doing a 12 or 14-hour a day ain't that different than what they do normally. It is exhausting. I don't know how these people do it, but it is an exhausting job. So they're quite accustomed to it. And 90% of the itinerary is substantive. And then 10%, we also want them to get out and do some fun things. So you saw that hike that the guys did in Zion National Park. We had Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy came up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the winter from Orlando. She wanted to see what a real winter was like with 15-foot snow drifts. And one of the things, we went to Michigan Tech University and we saw the work that they're doing on wood energy. And we went to a Native American health clinic, and we met with the mayor of Marquette, Michigan, and talked about economic development. But then in the evening, we did 2 things that were quite unique. There just happened to be the rival hockey game between Michigan Tech and Northern Michigan University, and the 2 members got to drop the puck at center ice to start the game. And then, if that wasn't enough, we took them to a dog sled race, and the 2 members ran with the dogs before the race started. So talk about a photo op with the snow coming down. So we've gone mountain biking with a couple of members of Congress, one of whom was an Arkansas forester. He actually graduated from the Yale School of Environment. And so it was more than just a mountain bike ride. It was a lecture about trees. So we'd stop every 200 yards and he'd say, oh, you see this tree? Here's the root system. Here's the watering system. It was amazing. Yeah, I mean, having fun is part of it, but these are, serious discussions. We've gone to military bases, to national parks, to lots of manufacturing facilities. We've gone to lots of universities and colleges. But I also want to, before I forget, I want to tell you about the trip that your Congresswoman, Lisa Blunt Rochester, did. She was one of our first participants back in 2018, and she hosted, I think it was actually the 2nd or 3rd trip that we ever did. Rodney Davis, who's now left Congress, but a Republican from Central Illinois, and he came out to Delaware, and then I don't know if it was 6 months later or the next year, I can't remember. She came to Central Illinois, so they both had a lot of agriculture commonality, because as I understand it, there's more chickens in the state of Delaware than there are people.
Easily.
So, but in Central Illinois, it's all about soybeans and corn. But among the things that we did is we took her to the Lincoln Museum and library in Springfield. And we had a discussion with the state historian, talking about kind of what would Lincoln have done if he were alive? What was partisanship and bipartisanship like in the days of Lincoln's presidency? And then there was a knock at the door, and in comes this guy pushing a cart with gloves on, and he stops in our conference room, and he takes the cover off the cart, and he shows us 3 documents. He shows us a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, showed us the notes to the Gettysburg Address, and showed us the original manuscript for the 13th Amendment. And so for a congresswoman who is a descendant of slaves, when she saw those documents, tears came down, and the 2 members of Congress embraced. I mean, I couldn't take a picture because I didn't want to spoil that very moment. I will never forget seeing that. It was an unbelievable, memory that will be etched in my head forever. So, and the fact that it wasn't planned, that it was even more astounding. So those are the kinds of things. So the 2 of them, continue to have a good relationship. But anyways, I'm sorry.
That's great. Lori Bernstein had a question.
I put it on the chat, but do you always usually just take 2 people on a trip? Have you ever added more? Like a group of 4 or a group of 6?
The one-on-one relationship's really important. You really want to develop that friendship, and we think it would be harder to do it with a bigger group. So at this point, it's a one-on-one thing. It's a good question, but it'd be interesting to see what would happen. But we're interested in it being just a pairing.
Leslie?
I too want to thank you. This has just been so enlightening, but it's so enlightening, but I've sort of like, why don't we hear about this? Like, to me, that would give me so much more hope in our government, knowing this is going on. And the positive stuff, and we only hear the negative stuff. And it's so important to get this out there. And especially like Lisa Blunt Rochester, to tell her story and how she felt when she was in Illinois. I mean, that just brought tears to my eyes, just picturing that. So is there some way that you can really get this more out there?
Yeah, we have a whole communications team that works with the media staff of the 2 members that are participating. We get a lot of media attention in the district that they're visiting. And the members are not shy at all about wanting to tell the world that they're doing this. So we've done press conferences, we've done editorial board meetings, we've done lots of other, and members are tweeting out pictures and words constantly throughout the trip. So there's a lot of attention in the districts. We have hit the national spotlight a couple times. We were on Good Morning America, and cameras came out, and actually this was in Minnesota, and followed members around. And we've gotten a few bits of interest right now to embed a reporter on one of our trips, which we're looking to do this year. So it's hard to break through. You got to compete for attention, but this program's gotten quite a bit of recognition. I mean, if you just Google it, you'll see all sorts of clips and releases and so forth.
Any other questions? Alan?
And I don't want to take, when the time's up, stop me or take up anybody else's time.
I'm not going anywhere. So
okay. So it sounds like you've had about 80 members in total.
Well, no, not quite, because a lot of members are taking 2 trips. So we've had 40 trips. We've had
I just multiplied by 2.
About 50 members.
Okay. So have you ever brought them into a session, some type of show and tell in Congress to other members?
Yes.
I mean, I assume they would be your very best ambassadors.
You got it. That's exactly right. So there are a number of caucuses that exist where we have done presentations and the members have talked about their experiences. So there's a group called the New Democrats, which is basically a group of moderate Democrats, about 60 of them we've presented before them. The Blue Dog Democrats, which is a group of conservatives that we've met with along with the members. And we just did in January a reception on Capitol Hill where 14 of our alumni, ACE alums, came and talked glowingly about the program. It's all on video, and we're sending that out to member offices as we recruit members to go on the trips. So you're absolutely right. That is our most important spokesperson, is the folks that have done the trips.
You know, I just to stick in, when Joe Biden was a senator, he used to hold these things that he called the Biden seminars, and they were for constituents, donors, whatever. And he would often refer to his friendships, not only with John McCain, which is, you know, pretty well known, but with Orrin Hatch and
right.
And I you know, having a partner in the White House who understands and gets the importance of these kinds of personal relationships, this might be a good time to get on 60 Minutes or something like that, with a little help from some friends. But I think it's great.
Yeah. I mean, I will tell you, I've had the pleasure of staffing about 80% of these trips. I don't go on every one. So I've gotten to know, a large number of members of Congress and know them well. I mean, you spend 48 hours with somebody, you get to know them. I got to tell you, every one of them that I've encountered are decent, interesting, smart people who, I mean, first of all, you don't get to Congress if generally speaking, if you're a boring personality. I mean, these are pretty fascinating. They've had great, amazing career paths that got them to where they are today, that they, talk about. They've got a lot, they just don't have good incentives. That's their problem right now. They want to do the right thing, and they are patriots and good people. And I've been impressed with them. I'm impressed with the caliber of the people that represent our country in Congress. There are the exceptions. There's 35, anger-tainers out there who unfortunately get, 70% of the media attention. I don't know if that's the exact equation, but most of them are pretty good people. You may not agree with all of them, but I'm saying their fundamentals are good.
Any other questions for Jonathan? Oh, Barbara.
Yeah. Well, comment and a question. With all due respect, I take issue with, I mean, maybe the people that you meet on the trips are decent people, but when, what was it, at least half of the Republicans, voted to not certify the election. This was after they were, hiding from, domestic terrorists. So I can't see how one could say those were decent people. So that's my comment.
Can I stop you there for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Can I comment on that? So I'm glad you brought that up. So after January 6th, we sat down as a organization and had a very thorough discussion and passionate discussion about what we should do regarding those 140, I think it was 147 members that voted not to certify the election, all Republicans, which would, knock out 2/3 of the Republicans or so. Should we not invite them on trips anymore? Should we put them on, probation? Should we invite them to be? Should we not dismiss them? And it was a tough discussion, and it took a while to resolve, but we resolved it with the idea that it wouldn't help us as an organization or the program to just dismiss that large block of members. That they're still going to be there. They're going to get, most of them will get reelected, just as a percentage basis, and they will be an influence in the Congress and in what legislation gets passed. We got to work with them. We got to figure out a way to work with them. There have been Democrats, there have been a handful of Democrats who will not go on a trip with someone who voted against certification. And we accept that.
I understand what you're saying, and I think it's a complicated issue beyond Congress people, because I have friends who are on all sides, including QAnon, believe it or not. And the person's still my friend, and it's challenging. But my question is, do you track like the results that you get from these trips?
Yes, assiduously. We do. We have a whole database of what the outcomes have been, what the relationships are like, what the legislation that has been approved or worked on, what kind of committee involvement or how is their committee involvement and issue involvement changed. So yes, and also because our funders demand that.
I guess the last question is, do you think some Congress people won't participate and wouldn't want to be publicized because they're afraid of what their constituents might say or their donors? And then I guess I assume Kevin McCarthy doesn't go to any of these things. Maybe I'm wrong.
You're not going to find the leaders of either party participating in this. I mean, first of all, it's the time. You wouldn't be able to get 24 or 48 hours of Kevin McCarthy or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi when she was the speaker. So that and the top leaders will. In fact, I don't think there's even a case where we've asked them because it's just impossible. But yes, there are a handful of members that, like I said, will never go on these trips, and that's okay. There's 435 to choose from. there's plenty to choose from.
Julie, you have a question.
Well, really, I just wanted to say thank you to my brother-in-law, Jonathan, who I'm just so grateful for you to take time from your very busy schedule to be with us, and from Chicago to Delaware. If you were in Chicago, I don't know, you're around all over the place. Okay. And I'm always bragging on you. And, I know some people couldn't be with us in person, but have asked for the video. So this will be on our YouTube channel, and I will try to share it a lot. I think the word really needs to get out because people get so discouraged about, the gridlock and about the polarization in our world. And now you can see it's going on in Israel right now too. So the work you're doing is invaluable. And I just, I'm very glad that our Social Justice Committee hosted this. So Leslie are the chair people, and for you, Jonathan, being here, and everyone who could come. So just like a huge thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be a guest in your congregation, Julie, and I'm very proud of your leadership and what you're doing at Seaside, and I hope to get out there in the not too distant future. Can I just leave you all with a last word? So this actually part of what I'm going to say comes from the former director of a theater company in Chicago that my wife Melissa and I have followed and supported for some time. So he was actually talking about theater, but as we all know, a lot of politics is theater, right? And as Ronald Reagan, knew, if actors can be politicians and politicians can be actors. And we had a lot of fun with that, of course, at the Capitol steps. But Nick Sands was his name. He's no longer the director there. But I thought it applied really well to this program when he talked about the importance of theater. He said, it matters that we come together to engage with each other with curiosity, courage, and compassion. It matters that we dare to feel, to cry, to laugh, to be angry, to suffer, to argue, and to think with mind and heart. It matters that we challenge our perspectives of the world and have empathy for one another, because that defines who we are and who we are going to be in the future. What ACE does is expand and enrich, and this is me talking now, not him, is expand and enrich and connect our hearts and minds through thought-provoking conversation. Without each other, we travel nowhere. But if we travel together, I'm convinced that we can be inspired, and our Congress can be inspired to be better, to do better, and to become who we would like to be in a world that we would like to see.
Thank you, thank you,
Yeah,
thank you. Having just come back from Israel, apropos of our earlier conversation, we had the opportunity to hear a gentleman who he was a Muslim, an Israeli, an Arab, and he was a university professor. And when he was questioned about how he thought the future might go, is there a solution? Would there be one state solution, two state solution? He was very pessimistic. And what he came back on is exactly your point. And that is, it's all going to be about the personal relationships that develop between people so that they will understand and appreciate where they all come from.
Right.
So I think there are so many applications for the wonderful work that you're doing. And on behalf of Seaside, we all say thank you. We may not have been a huge group tonight, but we were mighty, and I appreciate
with great questions.
I
and very well
appreciate
informed.
Yeah, I really appreciate everybody's time and interest and questions. So thank you, and maybe you'll come visit us at the beach.
I look forward to that.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Pleasure to meet you. Yes, thanks so much.
Bye-bye.